Hello and welcome to the programme. It's been a great week for sellers of MAGA merchandise. The man in the red cap confounded pollsters who predicted for weeks it was neck and neck and too close to call. But it was called decisively and early. A victorious, if not magnanimous, Donald Trump calling it himself hours before the news networks, on stage with family and friends, supporters at Mar-a-Lago Beach Resort in a predictably offbeat speech, thanking those around him, including his family, Elon Musk, and as you do, the owner of the Ultimate Fighting Championships, Dana White.
Nobody's done a better job in sports, and you know, he's a very motivational kind of a guy. What he does, he gets these fighters and they really go at it, and it's become one of the most successful sports enterprises anywhere at any time.
It's been a week the Spanish royal family won't forget, pelted with mud and eggs in Valencia as they toured the worst-hit streets after the deadliest floods in decades, with Queen Letizia in tears. King Felipe tried to reason with the crowd, shouting, "Asesinos, murderers," locals and survivors accusing the authorities of not giving them advance warning and leaving them to their own fate. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez turning back for his own safety, according to his team.
We need to understand the anger and frustration of many people because of the hardship they've endured, and the difficulty in understanding how all the mechanisms and emergency response operations work.
And it's been a week that's seen a dramatic end to Germany's coalition government. Chancellor Olaf Scholz firing his finance minister, Christian Lindner, accusing him of betraying his confidence, telling reporters the man's ego was totally incomprehensible. Mr. Lindner's party, the Free Democrats, hit back, calling the Chancellor a liar. A political thriller worthy of a house of cards, and it's still playing out. A minority government limps on, a confidence vote to follow. What next? Snap elections? You might very well think that.
Too often he has engaged in petty party political tactics. Too often he has broken my trust. He even cancelled the agreement on the budget after we had already agreed on it in lengthy negotiations. There is no basis of trust for further cooperation.
OK, so joining us on the US presidential special for the World this week, from the World's Press Corps, with me in the studio, Elisabeth Pinault, correspondent covering French politics and life at the Elysée for Reuters. Elisabeth, I think I've counted more than 70 phone calls from world leaders for Donald Trump so far. Do we know how quickly President Macron's call came in and what the mood was?
It was, I think, one of the first ones, at least in Europe. So, yes, it was, well, they know each other, actually, Macron and Trump. Macron is the only European leaders who knows how to work with Trump because he was already president when Donald Trump was at the White House. So they know each other.
It's interesting because there's a lot of leaders kind of at an I'm Spartacus moment saying, I am the Trump whisperer. We hear about it, Mark Rutte, the NATO chief. We hear it about, some say, Viktor Orban. But actually, Emmanuel Macron could possibly stake a claim.
He wants it. He wants to be the leader. He wants to be the one who can talk to Trump. But as you said, Viktor Orban is a friend. Is a true ally of Donald Trump. We cannot call Macron an ally of Trump. It's almost the contrary, actually.
Yeah, I think he called, on the Joe Rogan programme, called Emmanuel Macron a friend, but, quote, a wise guy as well. Very interesting. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Also with us, Vivian Walt, globe-trotting correspondent for Time magazine, Prospect 2, friend of the programme, and I think I'm right in saying recently back from the US. Tell us about your week and also just the moment you found out.
Well, I must say I could not sleep the night of the elections. I did stay up watching the results all night long, I guess around about 3 a.m. Paris time.
Where were you?
I was in Paris, but I was just back from California, so jet lag worked for me. Yes, I think that there was a kind of sinking inevitability about it. It reminded me very, very much of the night in 2016 when he won. A kind of realization of, but of course he won. And I think that really is something that we're grappling with, the kind of foreseen aspect of this election. It was not a shock.
But you've foreseen aspect. You spent time in California, you also spent time in New York, both states won by the Democrats, but with an increasing amount of votes for Donald Trump, including in California, the Latino American vote as well. Were you getting hints of that?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, you know, few people dare to put up Trump signs outside their house in most parts of California. But certainly people didn't have much faith in the Democrats. They thought that the Democrats were out of touch. There was tremendous sort of lingering anger and frustration about President Biden's clinging to power as long as he did, and there were many other aspects which appeared to really weaken the campaign.
We're going to start to dig deep into some of those. Vivian, great that you're here with us. From London, Chris Morris, CEO of Full Facts, the independent fact-checking team campaigning to expose and counter the harm it does. Many will recognise Chris Morris's face, the BBC's former international correspondent, who, Chris, I think you've covered pretty much every continent, an old mucker of mine in Brussels too. Tell us about your week.
Well, it was a pretty extraordinary week, wasn't it? When you think that, the Washington Post, I think, counted more than 30,000 false or misleading claims made by Donald Trump in his first term. People knew that, and tens of millions of them still voted for him because it didn't matter to them. What mattered was his promise to make them personally better off. That's what swung the election in the end, I think. It's also because one of his political superpowers is having an almost gut instinct of how best to reach people on an emotional level. And emotions have always played a bigger role in politics than facts. Even I, running a fact-checking organization, have to accept that. That's how we learn. Storytelling has been hardwired into our DNA for generations. And Donald Trump's got a real gift as a storyteller. And people seem to have been prepared in their tens of millions to look past some of the darker side. And there was, as we all know, some pretty dark things said by Donald Trump during this election campaign. They put that to one side and said, this guy's going to put more dollars in my pocket.
Very interesting. A storyteller, a weaver of dreams, a seller of nightmares, promising simple solutions to very complicated questions, and with the help, perhaps, of Elon Musk as well and his social media algorithms. You've been very busy, Chris, in the past 24 hours alone, debunking all sorts of stories all over the world, fast spreading. I want to talk about, for example, the new British Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, born in Nigeria, claims that you debunked, images about a Palestinian girl trapped under rubble, shared tens of thousands of times. Not as it seemed, not true. And also want to talk about this. You've set up a separate Full Fact AI site. One of the picking up, I must say, about the US elections, a bizarre image. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, clearly fake to some seeing what we're about to see now. But the key word here, Chris, is some.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what people will believe, to be honest, but they do believe it, and we have to take that seriously. And we have AI tools, which, in fact, a couple of organizations in the US have been using them, which essentially allow a fairly small group of people to monitor a vast amount of information. Because I think we all know that new technology is part of the problem in the spread of misinformation. It turbocharges the opportunity to do that. But technology's also got to be part of the solution, because it's the only way we can keep across thousands and thousands of hours of video, of audio, of text on the internet. It's the only way to do it. So we have to embrace the technology and believe that we can use the technology for good. And that's what we're doing with the AI tools, which we built. And as I say, they're being used in the US. They're also being used across the Middle East and Africa as well. And I think that's part of the solution to misinformation, even though it's also part of the problem.
Very interesting. A few minutes ago, I was talking to John Bolton, the former security advisor to Donald Trump, Chris. He was talking about AI. He was talking about Elon Musk as well, and saying there are big security issues to be looked at. We're going to look at that as well in the programme very shortly. Let's go first to New Orleans. Let's bring in Oliver Lachlan, the Guardian's US Southern Bureau Chief and Investigations Correspondent, presenter of the series Anywhere But Washington, which I think is a brilliant watch, understanding the atmosphere in the US right now. Oliver, thank you so much for being with us. A Trump victory. You crisscrossed the states for weeks. Did you see this coming?
I mean, I think it's always been on the cards. It's been on the cards ever since Donald Trump was effectively allowed to run again by not being convicted in the Senate after he encouraged an insurrection on January 6th. I mean, I guess what I have seen in the many states that I have visited is an entrenchment of Trump support. So his base has not changed. It's expanded, as we've seen in the results this time. And I think what I've also observed is a kind of degree of disengagement that I was quite surprised to see. A lot of voters that I came into contact with who definitely voted in 2016, 2020, told me they weren't planning to vote this time because they've grown apathetic, basically. And I think that's partly a consequence of, the 8 years of Donald Trump, the rampant disinformation and lies that have characterized his tenure and time in office. So, yeah, I mean, I think, as many people were, a little bit shocked, but not surprised by his victory.
Yeah, your programme is worth watching, even on YouTube back, even this time on, because you really get to understand. You go door knocking with both sides. You see people, in their pyjamas and less, opening their doors, not really wanting to vote, but some of them being persuaded. You really get a glimpse of how the day-to-day persuasion works. Let's take a glimpse of election night from your series, Anywhere But Washington.
Do you acknowledge that there will be a large portion of the country that will be extremely devastated and quite shocked if Trump wins?
We know. We went through it, so they can go through it this time. How's that?
This is for the working class, the middle class. God bless Donald Trump.
Lock him up! Send him back! Woo! Jesus! Jesus!
I'm speechless. After all we've been through with Trump, after all the crap he says, almost half the country's like, yeah, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Oliver, tell us about your experience on election night in both camps with the Republicans and the Democrats. What was that like?
So I was in Michigan, in Detroit, and then out in the suburbs of Detroit. It was, obviously a night of contrasts. So the election night party that I was at in Detroit, which was a Kamala Harris one, there was a real sense of optimism, I think, before the results started rolling in. There was obviously this poll that came out in Iowa a few days before that suggested that we may be expecting, a very different result from the one that we got. But very gradually, in fact, not that gradually, I'll be honest, it was within a few hours, people started to realize that this was not going how they expected it to, people leaving very quickly. A real sort of sense of disbelief, I think, and a real example of how, the reality on the ground in America is starkly contrasting. It's almost two different worlds. So people who get their facts and information from certain sources, people who read The Guardian, people who read the New York Times, people who read reliable sources of information, and then others who, most broadly vote for Donald Trump, who are existing in a completely different parallel universe. And so that election night party that I went to in the Detroit suburbs was a real example of that, a real kind of mixture of competing ideologies and people who see the world very, very differently to their fellow Americans, all under one roof, maybe not having the exact same political opinions as each other, but united entirely behind Donald Trump and what he represents.
Very interesting, the difference between what information you're getting, what you're reading, what Donald Trump is saying, and the reality. I want to talk to you in a moment as well about Pennsylvania and the closing of industries there and the immigration tales and peddle stories that you were hearing there as well. But let's look back to Wednesday, 2:30 a.m. in Florida, the Madrugada, as it's known in Spanish. The results haven't yet been called for the key tipping point swing state of Pennsylvania, but all roads appear to be leading Donald Trump to the White House. There is enough for Donald Trump to call the result, assembling the team around him on stage. 25-minute speech rambled from his own victory to hyperbolic tales of those around him. One for the history books to consider, his claim to have masterminded the greatest political movement of all time.
Hey, look what happened. Is this crazy? But it's a political victory that our country has never seen before, nothing like this. I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president. And every citizen, I will fight for you, for your family, and your future. Every single day, I will be fighting for you, and with every breath in my body, I will not rest until we have delivered the strong, safe, and prosperous America that our children deserve and that you deserve. This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have.
Well, as he continued to take in his comeback moment, this footage went viral as he sat with his lawyer, Alina Habas. He was played a Natasha Owens song from 2023. Everyone knows Trump won, promoting the false claim he won 4 years ago. Let's take a look. Congratulations at Mar-a-Lago. 13 and a half hours later came the consolidation speech from Kamala Harris, one that had been postponed from the early hours when the writing was on the wall and when thousands of her own supporters who gathered at Howard University in Washington went home. When the speech came, the rhetoric was not down and out, not consolatory. She sought to stir the spirits.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright.
So Donald Trump has won the presidency, winning the Electoral College vote, set to win the popular vote as well. Republicans have taken the Senate. They may get the House of Representatives too. Analysts describe this widespread, consistent repudiation of 4 years of the Biden administration in all parts of the country, across demographic groups. Oliver, is there a key thing to you that came up time and time again? And the obvious thing seems to be the economy, but was it as simple as that?
I would say no, to be totally honest. I mean, I think obviously it explains some of the shift towards Donald Trump that has happened, in various demographics that we've spoken about. But, one of the things, I spent a lot of time going door to door with canvassers on both sides. And I think there were a variety of issues that people were concerned about, ranging from abortion rights, ranging from immigration. But yeah, I mean, the economy obviously underscored a lot of people's discontent. Rising inflation in the United States has been one of the major issues of the Biden administration for many years. And, Trump's victory itself comes in the context of every other party in power that's faced election losing power this year. And I think, this is a year in which we have seen opposition parties win against the backdrop of rising costs of inflation. And so, yeah, it's impossible to sort of disassociate that global context from what's going on here too.
And I think Chris, very interesting point, Oliver. I think Chris also touched upon something, Vivian, when he talked about the personality cult of Donald Trump.
Yes, indeed. And, Oliver talks about the economy. And of course, it's always about the economy in every election and has been. But there's something more that we haven't spoken about, and that's economic inequality, which is vastly widened since Trump first came on the scene. The American economy is doing very well, actually. It's almost full employment. The stock market is rocketing. But people in the vast middle of the country are working class. They see an enormous amount of people getting very, very rich, including, ironically, Donald Trump. And yet they themselves do not have a piece of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that ongoing, lingering annoyance and aggravation is something the Democrats just never grappled with and still have not grappled with. And they have lost the working class, which means they've lost the bulk of America. And I think that is something that's going to take them a long time to really come to terms with and to try rebuild.
There's so much of what you've just said, I think you'll agree, Oliver, that's within your piece. I'm thinking of Louisiana, you talking to those, that last sort of hut selling food with the woman you spoke to saying that it's never been as bad for her, the economy. People might be doing well, but the inflation is making things unaffordable. You talk to a man who's losing his job in Pennsylvania. That clearly is something that chimed with you on across a number of states.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the difficulty when you're speaking to folks in those situations is the reality is Donald Trump is not really offering them much either. We can talk about that plant that you mentioned in Pennsylvania. That was in a town called Charleroi, which is in Western Pennsylvania, has become a fixture of a lot of Donald Trump rallies, not because there's, the largest employer in town closing down, but because he's targeted Haitian immigrants who have moved to that town. And I asked that guy, wouldn't you rather he be talking about, ways of preserving your livelihood and your job? And he said, yes, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. And, that to me points to the kind of broader populism of the Trump movement, this idea that by targeting the most vulnerable in society, by talking about mass deportations, by blaming quite literally almost every single problem in the United States on this idea of illegal immigration, that will somehow solve the very broad inequality issues that your guest just spoke about. It's not true. It's demonstrably untrue. But in a time of rampant disinformation, it cuts through in a way that is very, very difficult for people who are articulating facts and trying to make reasonable, plausible arguments for way through to cut through.
Chris, when you listen to Oliver making a very good point about disinformation, just explain to us the size of your job when you're trying to expand the operation as full fact, and you're dealing with this Trump presidency who has to his right-hand side the world's richest man in control of the information space, in control of the algorithm for his users. How you would access, well, first of all, the challenge you face and your view of the influence that Elon Musk has.
Well, it's going to be interesting, I think, how all the big internet platforms respond to Donald Trump. Don't forget, a few years ago, he was banned on Twitter. He was banned on Facebook. Obviously, we know where Elon Musk now stands. What about the other big companies? What about Meta? What about Google? My guess is they will not be as adversarial as they have been in the past, but I don't think they'll roll over either. So there will be some sort of free exchange of information there. But in terms of the scale of the challenge, I mean, look, we were just talking about immigration. I think an illegal immigration in particular, what Donald Trump has done essentially is given those people who feel they're losing in life a sense that there are still people they can look down on. And those people are the illegal immigrants. I think US government statistics say that reckon there are about 11 million illegal immigrants in the United States. If you listen to Donald Trump, you would presume they have all arrived in the last 4 years. In actual fact, 75–80% of them have been in the US for at least 15 years. Some of them have been living and working there for decades. So he's made some pretty big promises. I'm going to deport all these people. How exactly is he going to do that? What about the legal challenges? What about potential gaps in the workforce if he came anywhere close to being able to do what he's promised to do? So, he's made some very big promises. And I noticed in his acceptance speech, his first speech after the results came out, he was very keen on that phrase, promises made, promises kept. So he does seem to have some awareness that he has made some big promises and now he's got to keep them.
Yeah, that is very interesting. When you listen to that, Elizabeth, when you listen to Chris talking about immigration, when you're covering the scenario from the Elysee, looking at how the French government are dealing with these issues, these are all reflective issues: immigration, the economy, familiar themes in France too. What do you make of the result?
Well, this election is seen very closely by France, of course. All the channels are special editions during all night, and of course it's also observed very closely by the political parties, because we see that the French political parties have got the same problems in a way, with the left losing the workers, for instance, who are going more to the far right now. So they say, well, that what's happening in America could happen here. So they just, of course, as French, as European, everybody knows it's a new era starting now, and not for the good. And they know that about Ukraine, about the Middle East, about climate change, about NATO. Things are going to change, and Europe is worried. France is worried. During the call between Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron, it was yesterday, Thursday night. It was almost half an hour, and they talked about Ukraine and the Middle East. And then Emmanuel Macron went to Budapest for a first European summit, and of course they discussed the American elections, and they know that now there is a commercial war starting between the US and France and Europe, with the promise that Donald Trump did, that he would rise the tariffs on goods coming from outside, and especially from Europe. So and there is a fear of division in Europe, because we know that parts of the heads of state are quite interested by the Trump camp. I mean, we've got the Hungarian, but also Italy, Sweden. And it's not small countries. So it's an era of uncertainty is starting, and I think everybody is very aware that something new, a new chapter is opening now. And everybody's looking at it with a sense of worry.
Can you decrypt for us to decipher the herbivores and carnivores speech that Emmanuel Macron has made, talking about we in Europe who cannot be seen as the herbivores that are just feasted on by the carnivores of the US and China. We need to be omnivores.
Yes, well, that's what he said and what many people said. Even Marine Le Pen, who is the head of the far right in France, yesterday, she said, well, Europe has to wake up. Because she didn't say, well, Trump is my friend and this is great. She didn't say that. That was interesting. She said, well, he wants to, I think of the French, she said. And she said, if Trump wants to make a commercial war against Europe and France, we have to wake up. Europe has to wake up. And that's what Macron is saying. He wants to take the leadership of that. Because that's Macron, you know, he always wants to run things. He wanted to talk with Putin about Ukraine. It failed. He wants to talk to Trump now, and he wants to lead Europe and wake Europe up. Of course, if you want to shake Europe, you need France and Germany. And both countries have got very weakened governments now. So it's not going to be easy.
You've just made me think, because the fact that Marine Le Pen didn't go to the US. I think in 2016, she was seen a lot at Trump Towers. And yet, if you look what's going on across the channel in the UK, you've had Nigel Farage, an MP on the far right, populist, going to the US, part of the entourage in Mar-a-Lago. And again, his big issue, immigration. Oliver, that takes me back to you, because the complexity of immigration, I think you actually laid out very clearly, particularly I'm thinking of Arizona. Let's have a look at one of your conversations across in Arizona. This is with a Trump supporter, a Latin American woman, explaining why she's voting Donald Trump.
You're a Mexican American.
Yes.
What do you think about Trump's border policy?
I love it. I love it. I'm 100% for it.
Do you know anybody that crossed the border without applying for green card?
Oh, yes. Unfortunately, I have family members that did. Cousins, nephews, nieces.
Because those people might be deported if Donald Trump wins.
That's okay. That's okay.
How long have they been here for?
Years, like 20, some like 30 years.
And so you think the members of your own family who've been here for 30 years should be deported?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, they can be deported, but they can also apply to come back again to the United States, but do it the right way.
How do you think they would feel about you saying that?
Oh, they would be very angry. They are angry at me right now. They don't talk to me because I support Trump.
Oliver, that's an eye-raising moment. Tell us about that, how common that was. I mean, it's clearly stood out to you.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I've been to God knows how many Trump rallies at this point over the past 8 years, and I have never heard anybody say they would be comfortable with members of their own family being deported in order to kind of realize Trump's policy position of mass deportations. But I think it kind of speaks to this broader point that we have seen in the exit polling that's happened after the election result. Latino voters have moved further and further towards Trump. And I think it's very important to say that, that does not mean, Latino is a very broad phrase. We can talk about Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and other groups. In fact, Mexican Americans voted more for the Democrats than they did for Donald Trump. But yeah, I mean, in these border states, and particularly the border counties, so I think Trump won 8 of the 10 border counties this time around. I've very much seen over the past 4 years a rightward drift. People who, came here as immigrants, but see themselves very differently to people who either came without paperwork or came more recently, and see it as a kind of us versus them dichotomy, which, may be surprising to a lot of people, but I think, has become far more popular than a lot of people understand. And that to me was kind of the most extreme iteration of that. And I was quite confronted when I had that iteration.
Another thing that we haven't touched upon yet, which a lot of people, or a number of people in a number of states do talk to you about as you travel for several months, which is gender politics and the issue of wokeism. Is fascinating. This is your time you spent in Ohio, the hometown of J.D. Vance. You were talking to a line of activists, Republicans supporting young men. Let's take a listen.
My first stop is a canvassing event with a group of young Republicans. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, we're with The Guardian. How you doing? Here, there are some very politicized definitions of what it means to be a man.
Well, I think the conservatives' picture of masculinity is hardworking blue-collar man that works hard to support his family, his wife, his livelihood, his home, his community. Whereas those on the left, I don't think know what a man is. They don't know what a woman is. They don't know what a man is.
How are you guys feeling about J.D. Vance?
I'm super happy with Trump's pick, because he's a fresh face. He's much younger generation than those running for that office in the past.
He also made some pretty, well, some people say defensive remarks about childless cat ladies and how they are miserable and are destroying the country. I just wonder what you think about that.
It's an election year, so they're going to take a joke and a soundbite and then just blast it and act like that is who J.D. Vance is. But, you know, that's Kamala Harris's messaging. But
I'm minded, Oliver, about the meme that people have been talking about, this idea of the past where you had a father saying to his daughter, I'm doing this, I'm voting for you, and you reverse it now to the mother who's telling their son, I'm voting for you in your future. Gender politics, how much of an issue did you find that was?
I found it everywhere, really, and I think it's only been exacerbated again by having a woman at the top of the ticket. The outspoken misogyny at many of these rallies that I have been to is eye-opening, and I'll leave it at eye-opening. And again, we sort of see that in the returns in this election. More women voting for Kamala Harris, more men than ever voting for Donald Trump. And I will just say, it's especially stark when we think about the people who have most to lose in this election, most to lose with the next 4 years of Donald Trump. That I think it's about 93% of black women voted for Kamala Harris, and a very small number of black women voted for Donald Trump. And, underpinning this kind of, bro culture that we were talking about there, this idea that Donald Trump has reached out to the manosphere and done all these podcasts and stuff, are very, very real consequences for women, often black women, living in conservative states that have abortion bans and many other policies that will disproportionately affect them. And that's what I've been thinking a lot about since the result.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Vivian, just to pick up on that, I mentioned the meme that's been going around about the woman telling her son, and Oliver talked about the percentage of black women voting for Kamala Harris, but I think overall about 46% of women voting for Donald Trump. What's your take?
I think that the Democrats just assumed that you put up a woman candidate, an enormous majority of women will support her. And certainly there was tremendous excitement about there being the potential for a woman president finally. And one of the best yard signs I saw in California was, it's about Madame time, meaning finally a woman president. But there were other issues that was simply more important. And I think when Oliver talks about all the gender identity politics, which really has suffused America tremendously in the last few years, I think it left a lot of people feeling quite alienated. They had more urgent problems to deal with. They didn't want to be discussing, whether there should be gender-neutral toilets or transgender, surgery rights or whatever. It seemed a distraction, and yet within the Democratic Party, sad to say, there was just a huge focus on it.
And if we look at reflections, Chris, in London, we've had this new Conservative leader voted in, Kemi Badenoch, and one of her biggest issues was this, quote, war on wokeism.
Yeah, I mean, she's a really interesting choice simply because I don't think there are that many right-wing or right-of-centre Conservative parties in the world in the Western world, who would elect a black woman as their leader. So I think that reflects well on the UK in general, but very much so. She is certainly not from the left. She is anti-woke, and she is going to be setting out her stall on that. And I think probably trying to lean into that sort of culture war aspects of British politics, partly to try and see off the threat from her right flank, from Nigel Farage and the Reform Party.
Well, you talk about Kemi Badenoch. Very interesting about the other leaders and the other prime ministers, presidents, their teams that are now dealing with Donald Trump. In the 48 hours since his victory, I mentioned to Elizabeth, More than 70 conversations with world leaders by phone, Beijing calling, Paris calling, London calling. As it happened, many European leaders were heading for a summit in Budapest on Thursday. I think we can have a listen to what some of those presidents and prime ministers have been telling reporters of their initial reactions to a Trump presidency.
I had a very good meeting with President-elect Trump a few weeks ago when we had dinner together in New York, and that was very positive, very constructive, as I think you know. And obviously I had a phone call with him last night, again, very positive, very constructive.
The people of the United States have now elected him. He is the president. I worked very well with him for 4 years. He is extremely clear about what he wants. He understands that you have to deal with each other, to come to joint positions, and I think we can do that.
In the end, the debate, if we wanted to put it with a bit of humor that evokes American president, is don't ask what the United States can do for you, ask what Europe should do for itself. That's the topic of today's debate, and it is a especially important one.
The Americans will quit this war. First of all, they will not encourage the war. They will not say that war is a good thing. People say many things about Donald Trump, even those who do not like him. But nobody doubts one thing, which is that he will not start a war.
Where do we start? Chris, start with you and then to Vivian on this. I know you'll both be keen to say something because we've seen what fawning, some cautious, some diplomatic best behaviour on show. Keir Starmer, interestingly, his foreign minister, the foreign secretary, David Lammy, recently calling, well, in the last few years, calling Donald Trump a tyrant in a toupee.
Yeah, I mean, listening to the leaders there, number one, what else would you expect them to say? Number two, I do think it can be a bit easy to almost catastrophize the potential implications of a Trump presidency. And European leaders know they've got to get on with stuff. Trump has already had an impact in Europe. I mean, defence spending, European defence spending within NATO has risen by 50% between 2014 and 2024. And that's partly the Trump effect, it's partly the Putin effect. It maybe not gone as quickly as some people would like, but it has already changed politics in Europe, and it's going to continue to do so. But I do think this idea that the implications of the Trump presidency are bound to be disastrous for everyone can become overblown. And that's partly because, when I was based in the States back in a long time ago, back in the 1990s, elections come around pretty quickly. I mean, I know there's another 4 years until a presidential election, but it's only another 2 years until there will be there'll be more congressional elections. And at the moment, we know the Republicans have got the Senate. They're probably going to get the House. They could lose them again in 2 years. And it's not that unusual for the presidency and both houses of Congress to be in the hands of one party. And it can be a very short time, though, that happens in. So we may find ourselves having a conversation in a couple of years, which feels very different.
As we're talking, Chris, we're seeing to right of shot Baron Trump, who's been described as the golden boy, the golden strategist by his dad, saying that he chose his podcasts to go on. Oliver mentioned it a moment ago. The likes of Joe Rogan, more than 30 million hits. When you look at, fact-checking, for example, this is a whole new, changing world, isn't it? Just the length of interviews, for example, 3 hours with Joe Rogan. When you look at the strategy they had, media strategy, do you think that Kamala Harris should have followed suit and actually spoke to the likes of Joe Rogan?
I mean, maybe. There's no doubt that the Trump campaign was very clear where they needed to make an impact. The Harris campaign got plenty of endorsements from big Hollywood celebrities, which appear to have made no difference whatsoever. The Democrats historically have been the party of the working class for many, many years. They've lost that at the moment. It's no good being the party of Hollywood. It's not going to win you an election. And I'm sure that's one of many reflections which are going to be going through the Democratic Party from top to bottom over the next few months. But they will rebuild quickly and they will go again because, as I said, there are big elections. 2 years seems like a long time away, but it's not very long in American politics.
So speaks a man who has been to many countries covering many elections. Vivian, listening to Chris talking about different European leaders, interesting Viktor Orban's comments in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, look, Chris presents a pretty optimistic view, and I share quite a lot of it, actually. I do think that one ripple effect of Trump will be perhaps a more unified Europe rather than what Elizabeth says of or the fractures sort of breaking apart. Europe has got to get its act together, as Macron has been saying for 7 years. Now, Macron is a lame duck. No one really cares what Macron has to say about anything right now. But I think that European leaders realize that they are going to have to unify on defense. They're going to have to present some kind of fairly tightly knit, coherent policy, because otherwise they simply don't stand a chance in the face of a leader of the world's biggest economy who basically wants out of Ukraine and wants to simply move on.
Back to the herbivores and the carnivores. Oliver, just a last word for you, because it's just been fascinating just to follow your story of all of those states and what it's told us. Do you think any Democrat would have made a difference? You know, how much responsibility does Kamala Harris, Joe Biden have to take here? Was it always Trump's, as conversations you've had, the trips you've had, was it always his for the taking?
I mean, I think what probably would have made a difference is if Joe Biden had decided to withdraw from seeking a second term much sooner. I think if the Democratic Party had had a primary process and the chance to kind of, seek a new identity post Biden, that may well have, got them some more votes. Kamala was always going to be tied to, the legacy of the past 4 years because she is Joe Biden's vice president. I would just push back slightly on the optimism that we're hearing a little bit. I think Trump 2.0 poses a very, very different conundrum to not just people living in America, but throughout the world. Donald Trump has said that he wants to effectively remake the federal bureaucracy in his own mold. He wants to install loyalists throughout the US federal government and will be back harder and more extreme than he was in 2016, whether you're talking about ramping up mass deportations, ramping up oil and gas, ramping up more culture wars. And the effects that will have not only for, members of US society, but around the world. We can talk about what's going to happen in Ukraine, what will happen in Gaza, are unforeseen and most likely to be far more extreme than they were from 2016 to 2020.
Oliver, great to hear you. Thank you so much. Oliver Lachlan from The Guardian, whose series Anywhere But Washington is an absolute must-watch, and it's on YouTube. Chris Morris, CEO of fullfact.org, my old mucker, fellow Europe correspondent in Brussels. Thank you, Chris. Vivienne Waltz, seasoned Globe Trotter, a correspondent for Time Magazine and Prospect. Thank you, Vivienne. And Elisabeth Pinault, friend of the programme, insider on the goings-on at the Élysée and French politics. Thank you for watching. We're going to leave you with this from Trump's last presidency, reminding his NATO colleagues who is top dog or cat. See you in 7 days for The World next week.